Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, all is not well amongst the Western hegemonic front countries as rumblings of disagreements between the U.S. and Europe have erupted into a full-blown 9.0 earthquake on the Richter scale. Now, the Munich Security Conference may become known as the site where the stake was finally driven through the heart of the U.S.-led unilateral world. From Ukraine, NATO tariffs to Greenland, the U.S. Trump administration have turned Europe upside down in less than a month after coming to power. Well, what does it all mean and where is this going? Well, stay with us as we take a look at all of this on this spotlight. Let's start off with the following report.
As the war in Ukraine rages, European leaders fear they are being pushed to the sidelines. President Trump's renewed push for direct peace talks with Russia has sent shockwaves through the EU, raising concerns that Washington is willing to cut a deal without European input.
That Ukrainians will be at the table and Europeans will be at the table.
The answer to that last question, just as you framed it, the answer is no. The answer to the earlier part of that question is yes, of course the Ukrainians are going to be at the table.
Trump calls for a quick end to the war, even if that means Kiev making territorial concessions. His approach is driving a wedge between Washington and its closest allies. And then there's NATO. Trump's recent remarks questioning America's commitment to European defense have alarmed leaders across the continent. The U.S. has hinted that European nations must increase their defense spending, something Trump has long demanded.
And we told the European Union, we told the NATO people, largely they overlap, you have to pay more money because it's unfair what we're doing. We're doing a tremendous amount more. We're probably $200 billion more going into Ukraine, using for Ukraine to fight. And Europe has not really carried its weight in terms of the money. It's not equitable.
And the divisions don't stop there. Trade relations between the U.S. and EU are once again under strain. With Trump's tariffs on European goods, from cars to agriculture, potentially as high as 20%, the EU is considering retaliatory measures, raising the risk of a full-scale trade war. Meanwhile, the old idea of a U.S. push to acquire Greenland is making a return. Though Denmark has rejected any possibility of a sale, U.S. officials see Greenland's resources and strategic location as vital to American interests. From defense commitments to industrial policies, Europe and the U.S. seem to be more at odds than ever.
I'd like to welcome my guests to this program. Mike Billington, editor, Executive Intelligence Review out of Hamilton, USA. And John Ross, Senior Fellow of Chongyang Institute, Renmin University of China, out of London. Well, thank you both for being with me. Let's start this off with Mike. Mike, Trump has rocked the hegemonic front boat in ways many never would have imagined. He's only been in office about a month. Let's look at some of the ways he has broken some of the taboos that have been set basically since the U.S. has taken control of this rules-based system.
Well, the most important upheaval actually came from his vice president, J.D. Vance, who spoke at the Munich conference the other day, and quite correctly and quite powerfully, and for the first time in modern history, basically blasted the Europeans for the fact that they are failing at democracy. Now that's quite interesting. There's real questions about so-called democracy in the US as well. You know, Trump has been talking about silencing anyone who dares to criticize Israel. So, you know, free speech is not exactly unlimited in the United States. But what Vance had to say about Europe was absolutely true. He pointed directly at the Romania situation, where, as I'm sure you know, the EU stepped in to literally cancel an election because they didn't like the fact that the candidate who came out in front was a supporter of Russia, an opponent of the Ukrainian war. And of course, you have other countries across Europe who are also finally publicly expressing their anger at the fact that the isolation of Russia has not damaged Russia terribly. Their economy is booming, but it's undermining and destroying much of Europe. Germany is in a state of economic freefall, literally disintegrating. And yet they never lifted a finger against the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which was bringing them cheap oil and gas from Russia. Right. And everybody knows that that was done by American intelligence networks, as Seymour Hersh proved, and yet they're tolerating it. So the situation now is for the U.S. to come in and say, you know, you're not really following free speech and democracy by undermining any opposition forces on the right wing or the left. They've been silenced. Okay. And I think this is an accurate statement by Vance, and it's infuriating the Europeans because they know they're guilty. They can't really refute it.
Right. Well, definitely interesting times. I mean, John, Ukraine has been a project of Washington and Europe for decades now. And of course, we know that the war actually started in 2022 between Ukraine and continues until now. Now, Trump says the war must end and is about to hold talks with Moscow without the EU or Kiev. What does this move mean? What signal does it, or message does it send to the Europeans?
Well, what Trump's trying to do is very clear. It's what was been aptly termed a reverse Kissinger. That is, he wants to split Russia and China. Let's make look what the original Kissinger was. When the United States was losing the Vietnam War, it was losing it because the combination of the Vietnamese people, China and the Soviet Union was proving itself to be stronger than the United States. So Kissinger decided that the only way to deal with this was to try to split Russia and China using the Sino-Soviet split. And that was his whole orientation, and he duly orientated on that. And it was, from the point of view of the United States, a gigantic success. It culminated in the destruction of the Soviet Union. Now what Trump wants to do, and this is not implicit, there's lots of people in the United States who write this, is that instead what the United States has to do is to form an agreement with Russia in order to isolate China, so that China, which is considered by the United States to be its strongest competitor, so that China can be dealt with in an isolated way. Then if that was done successfully, which is not at all certain, of course, the United States would then turn around and attack Russia. And the final thing which is in that is that the United States hopes it will do certain deals, that Russia will not support certain countries in the global south, so that Russia and China will abandon Iran, they will abandon Cuba, they will abandon North Korea, and so that the United States can attack them individually. It's totally transparently clear what Trump is attempting to do, and he's quite prepared to get the Europeans out of the way in order to try to carry out what is regarded as a much more serious strategy.
That's a very interesting analysis. Mike, your thoughts on what John has said, and what does it mean then in the relations with the Europeans? I mean, is this over what we have been seeing for almost 100 years, I guess, but especially after World War II? I mean, your assessment first of what John has said, and what does it mean exactly for U.S.-European relations?
Well, that is what he's saying is somewhat the British view. In fact, their efforts to divide Russia and China have been in the forefront of this. Kissinger was actually a somewhat slavish follower of Chatham House, as he himself bragged that he reported the Chatham House before he reported to the State Department, even when he was Secretary of State. But the issue of what Trump's going to do is not clear. I don't think it is obvious what he's trying to do. He, as you probably know, just yesterday or the day before, said that once he gets things cleared up with the Ukraine situation and ends this war, and he's supposed to hold a private meeting with Putin soon, and some of his people are going to be meeting with the Russian people in Saudi Arabia any day now. And this should lead to an ending of this insane conflict in Ukraine and a restoration of sane relations between the United States and Russia. But he said that one of the first things he wants to do once that gets cleared up is to have meetings with both Putin and Xi Jinping to discuss reviving arms limitation policies, in particular to stop producing so many nuclear weapons, which, as he correctly said, we have enough to blow the world up 100 times. We don't need to keep producing them, nor does Russia, nor does China for that matter. And he wants to hold that meeting. It has to be remembered that when Trump came in his first term, he was extremely positive about China. He invited Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago. He then went to Beijing, had a wonderful trip, spent a full day with Xi Jinping getting a sort of a history lesson on the history of China and culture at the Forbidden City. And was committed to collaboration with China with some economic restraints. And he ended up getting sucked into going after China because of the COVID. And they convinced him that he had to basically blame China for the COVID. He called it the China virus and so forth, in order to not be blamed himself. And that was a big mistake he made. But I'm sure that he at least would like to be able to reestablish good relations with Xi Jinping, and let's hope he does. The only way that the West and the U.S. in particular are going to avoid a total economic disintegration, which is now in the works. It's in the works already in Europe, and it's threatening in the U.S. with a financial bubble unprecedented in human history, $2 quadrillion of derivative gambling debts. Which is about to explode. And the only way to properly deal with that is to sit down with Russia and China and the BRICS nations and the global South generally and formulate a new economic policy which addresses the security and development needs of every country on the planet. So this is the only hope that he has of getting out from under the economic disintegration that's now facing the West.
Okay, well, John, I mean, why is the European political elite so adamant about continuing the war, Ukraine-Russia war? And what does it mean when the UK is saying now that it is willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, and at the same time we have the Trump administration saying that they're about to sit down with Russia to end this? I mean, what does all of this mean in your perspective?
Well, it means that they understand that the United States and Russia, quite rightly, regard that Western Europe is incapable of playing an independent role in world politics. It's been groveling to the United States, or going along with the United States policies ever since World War II. It can't act independently. Its talk about putting full military forces into Ukraine is pure bluff. Can't possibly put military forces in there. And sufficient to deter the Russian army. And it's found itself in a situation where its acquiescence to the United States ever since World War II has now placed it in a great, huge mess. From what the United States is doing, there's no secret. The people like Mearsheimer, for example, I quote, who's a realist politician, said he would be prepared to fight and die in order to prevent China developing. And he thinks that the United States should get out of Ukraine because he wants to make an agreement with Russia in order to isolate China to attack it. And the people who will be sacrificed in that are the West Europeans, so that they object to it. As for the arms talk, the arms proposal of Trump, they're just cynical. What he's actually proposing to do with the 50% arms reductions is to cement in place US military supremacy, because its military budget is much bigger than that of either Russia or China, so that if you have a 50% cut, what will happen is the United States will maintain its military superiority. So it's just absurd talk about being peaceful when it's a quite cynical move. The only thing that would be reasonable would be, for example, the United States, Russia, all agreed to reduce their say, nuclear weapons to a certain level, say 1,000 or something, and China was unable to develop themselves up to the same level. So Trump's just carrying out his attack on China, and it's not, there's no secret, all the people around him proposed that, and they proposed this thing for a long time thing to do. What he wants from Russia is that Russia will agree to attack that other people, including Iran, but also Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil, other countries that go south.
Let me just jump in here, John. Let me just jump in here with, I want to talk about your analysis a little bit. I mean, why would Russia agree to this? Because Russia, like so many other countries, have seen what the United States can and will do to Moscow. So why would it turn its back, for example, on Cuba, that we know from the time of the Soviet Union to now that Moscow and Havana have very close ties, and other countries too. So why would Russia agree to something like this, in your perspective?
Well, I'm not saying that it will agree. I say that that's what Trump is trying to do.
Okay.
Russia is confronted with the following situation. Trump has to offer them something substantial. It's obviously what he would offer them. He'd offer them that Ukraine would not be in NATO. He will offer them that the 4 eastern provinces of Ukraine, either all of them or those which Russia controls apart, would become part of Russia. And there would be that the Ukrainian borders would disappear, as Hegseth said, and that the sanctions against Russia would be lifted. Mm-hmm. That all of which would be to the advantage of Russia. These would not be illusory gains, and Russia would have to consider, would very much like to get these things. He then hopes that Russia will accept that so that he can carry out his attacks on China and other countries.
Okay.
But whether Russia will or not, I'm not saying. I'm saying what he's trying to do. I'm not saying what will happen.
Okay. All right. Well, Mike, it is said by some experts that what we're witnessing inside the U.S. is a tug of war between the globalists and the capitalists. I mean, your assessment of what is taking place inside of the U.S. and the type of policies that we're seeing now coming out of Washington?
Well, it's mixed. I'm not sure that characterization is the best characterization.
How would you characterize it?
Well, the problem is that within Trump's circles, you have two totally different conflicting forces. I mean, you have 3 or 4 of the appointees, including Marco Rubio and Hegseth and others, are part of the old neocon war party, who think that the U.S. has to stick to being, America first by being open and willing to go to war. And that includes the people that want to have the conflict with China, which John seems to think is Trump's policy. I don't think it is. Trump has at the same time appointed and succeeded, and we helped to get Tulsi Gabbard confirmed as the new head of intelligence in the United States. The fact that the U.S. intelligence community has been so totally corrupted that we had people massively lying throughout, especially during the Biden years, but even well before that, they formulated fake stories to get us into wars against Iraq, against Libya, against Syria. They created this whole hoax about Russiagate, which now is known to be a complete farce, and yet it was used to basically drive Trump out of office and tried to prevent him from coming back in by a restoration of those silly, ridiculous lies. And yet that crew, I mean, the corrupted intelligence community, which also, of course, was weaponized in terms of their going after Trump personally and others, as they went after Lyndon LaRouche way back in the 1980s and 90s. That was really the first case of the weaponization of the FBI and the intelligence community against political leaders. And it became really outrageous in the last era, which Trump is committed to getting rid of. And he appointed Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard has, and Kash Patel, who hasn't firmly been confirmed yet, But both of them are committed to cleaning out the deep state, the corrupted permanent bureaucracy within the intelligence community, and to clean out this mess that has helped bring the U.S. to its current state of ruin.
Okay, well, John, what does this pivot out of Washington actually mean for Western alliances, such as NATO, in your perspective?
That Europe will surrender to the United States, the Western Europe, I mean. That the United States has controlled the situation in Europe ever since 1945. There's no longer any serious inter-imperialist rivalry. And Trump's calculation, which I think is entirely correct, is if he were able to do a deal with Russia, the Western European leaders would moan and groan, and then in the end they would go along with whatever the United States wants, so he can ignore them. And that's his calculation. I think that is a correct calculation of what the West Europeans would do. The problem is that in the question of the leadership of Russia, it can understand perfectly well. It's extremely intelligent. It understands what would happen, which is that it would turn that if the United States were able to defeat China, then the United States will, which is not at all certain, whatever Trump does. It's a very, very big deal because China is the most peer state of the United States. But if it were able to do so, then Trump will turn around and attack Russia, or the United States will turn around and attack Russia. That's because he made office then. And therefore they understand that. So therefore, why should they go along with this proposal? So what Trump is, therefore, there's one thing what Trump is trying to do. There's another is the calculations which will be taking place in Russia, because Russia also know the history of what happened with the catastrophe with the breakup of the Soviet Union. But that's what he's trying. There's a long way to go before he succeeds in this. Enormous obstacles, by which I'm not predicting that he will succeed in it. Just analysing what he is attempting to do at the present time, and it's perfectly logical, and it's not even implicit. There's lots of people in the United States who write that this is what the strategy was. It was a huge mistake, in their view, to have a simultaneous conflict between the United States and Russia and China. Therefore, it's got to neutralise, as China is the main enemy, it's got to neutralise Russia, and this is what they're attempting to do. It's not secret at all.
Well, Mike, really quick, I have about a minute or so. I mean, when we look at whether we're talking about the tariffs that the United States has proposed against the Europeans or Canada, are we looking at what it says it wants to buy Greenland from Denmark? I mean, do you agree with John that a lot of this is just like bluffing or trying to pressure the Europeans to try to get a little bit more? Or your assessment of this?
They're foolish policies. There's no question. The tariffs are not going to succeed in doing what he says they're going to do. His effort to take over Panama and Greenland is foolish. It's just as foolish as his crazy proposal for Gaza. The idea that the U.S. can take over Gaza and move 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza is absurd. It can't happen. There's no way it's going to happen. No Arab country is going to accept all these people, these migrants being shoved into their country. And the Palestinians aren't going to leave. They've suffered through one of the worst genocides in history, but they're not going to leave their homeland. So it's foolish stuff. And Trump has a certain bravado that he puts forward ideas that are almost self-evidently incapable of being implemented. So you can say he's just doing this as posturing and part of his negotiations, but nonetheless, you have to tell the truth about the fact that they're foolish. They can't work the way he says they are.
Right. On that note, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we're out of time. I thank both of you for being with me. Mike Billington, editor, executive intelligence review out of Hamilton. John Ross, senior fellow, Chongyang Institute, Renmin, University of China, out of London. And thank you, viewers, for being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.